Okay, what you see here are diagrams for how the court system works hierarchically. In other words, from entry level through the appellate process, meaning taking appeals, all the way to the top. On the right is a typical system in one of the states. Obviously, that's going to vary from state to state, and we'll talk a little bit about New York. I have a bit of a dilemma. If I stand in the center of the camera, I block the view, so we'll have to move back and forth a little bit. But anyway, on the right here, we have the state courts. So which system do we have on the left? Anybody? If it's not state, it's what? Federal, right, the federal system. Typically federal system, technically the federal system means the system that includes both the states and the federation. But usually when we say federal, you mean not the state side, the Uncle Sam side, right? So that's what we're talking about. So remember, the three branches of government we talked about last week, they exist in both state and federal government, but they're entirely separate tracks, they're entirely separate systems. You know, you don't go from state court generally into federal court. There are ways, and I'll explain that as we go through this. But generally speaking, they're quite separate sovereigns, you know, two separate sovereigns. The state of New York and the United States of America, two separate sovereigns. So, you know, the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, they're separate for each of those sovereigns. So it's important to remember that when you're dealing with the law, because you have state court and federal court, and you have to understand how they interact. So anyway, there's your state court system in a typical state, and we'll talk about New York more in a minute. And now we'll talk about what you have on the federal side. So we'll start at the top. Everybody's heard of these guys. There are 9 of them. The justices of the United States Supreme Court. They are appointed by the president, the Senate confirms them, and they have the last word on all matters of federal law in the United States. We know about them. Now let's jump back down to the bottom. When you file suit in federal court, where do you start? You start in one of the district courts. And keep in mind, sometimes state courts have the word district court. Whole different animal. Okay, the district courts, the United States district courts, they're named based on the states. But they are not state courts by any means. So right here where we're sitting now, I think I mentioned it in passing last week, which United States district court would cases that arise right here be heard in? Which state, federal district court? Anybody? United States District Court for the blank district of blank. For the Southern District of New York. Within the boundaries of states, there may be from 1 to 4 federal districts. They are not anything to do with the state itself. They're just geographic boundaries. So in New York, there happen to be 4 federal districts. Unsurprisingly, Northern, Southern, Eastern, Western. Southern and Eastern are small and big. By small, I mean geographically small. By big, I mean big in terms of population. So, I mean, here, and usually the federal, Congress provides the boundaries, and they wrote this into this federal statutes years ago. But, for example, the Southern District of New York covers cases arising in the counties of Manhattan, Bronx, and maybe Richmond, I'm not sure. The United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York covers cases in the counties of Kings and Queens, in other words, Brooklyn and Queens. I forget about Staten Island, I'm not sure which one that comes into. But remember, this is the federal system. Of course, the Southern District of New York covers more than just Manhattan and the Bronx. It also covers Rockland County and Westchester and certain other areas. The Eastern District covers pretty much, I'm trying to think, no, it's really just Kings, Queens, Nassau, and Suffolk. That's it for the Eastern District. So actually the Eastern District is geographically all of Long Island, because Kings and Queens are on Long Island. So geographically, cases that arise on the physical island of Long Island all go to the Eastern District. There are in fact 2 courthouses, one is in Brooklyn, one is in Central Islip. But anyway, those are the federal districts. The northern is where the capital is. Albany is in the northern district. So typically when you're suing about some government act of the state government, you might end up bringing it in the northern district of New York. And the western district is over there by Syracuse, Rochester, etc. Anyway, that's a typical division of the federal district courts. Remember, we're not talking about the state courts here. We're talking about the federal district courts, but they're geographically divided within the districts. We have a lot of variation among the geographic states as to how many district courts there are, and it's really a matter of population, right? So Vermont, how many districts do you think Vermont has, given the population of Vermont? 1, 4, 10? 1, yeah, 1. District of Vermont. District of Connecticut. District of New Jersey, although New Jersey is getting pretty big. You know, but California has like 4 districts. Texas has 4 districts. I don't remember all the variables, but it generally is a function of population. But anyway, bottom line is when you're suing in court, in federal court, you are going to be suing in the district that geographically has jurisdiction, or maybe not geographically, but it could be other reasons. But it's going to be a federal district court that has jurisdiction over your case. And I want to introduce another term. It's in the glossary, venue, but I'll save that for later. But when you're cross-referencing this against the glossary, remember the word venue, V-E-N-U-E. It's in the glossary. Okay, so we talked about the basis for getting into federal court in our first module. And bases, B-A-S-E-S, right? So where are you going to go? You're going to go start at federal district court. There is actually another federal court sort of below it, which is not a true Article 3 court, meaning it wasn't created by Article 3 of the Constitution. Anybody guess what it is? They're created by Congress, special court that doesn't do general cases, but they have a very specialized jurisdiction, bankruptcy courts. The bankruptcy courts are not true Article 3 courts created by Article 3 of the Constitution, but they obviously are part of the federal judicial system, but they're very specialized. They just handle bankruptcy. There are other very specialized courts in the federal system, Court of Federal Claims, Court of International Trade, but we're not going to get into that. They don't really have much to do with admiralty. But for the most part, any United States District Court could hear an admiralty case. Obviously, you're going to hear more in the Southern District of New York, Eastern District of New York, Eastern District of Texas, the ones that have a maritime connection, District of Iowa, probably not so many maritime cases. Actually, Mississippi might be involved. But the bottom line is that, all of them have jurisdiction, or could have subject matter jurisdiction over an admiralty case. Anyway, that's the entry level. Where do you go from there? You go to these courts. And I'm actually going to put up a different slide. I'm going to interrupt this to put up a different slide to show you the geographic reach of these courts. These are called the Circuit Courts of Appeal. The word circuit actually comes from back in the early days of the United States. The Supreme Court justices would hear appeals because it went from district court to whoever was going to hear it for the circuit. And what did the circuit mean? They literally rode the circuit. They would ride around in a horse and carriage, horses in a carriage, and go to the different, major cities within that geographical area and go there and hear cases that were being appealed from the district courts that sat there. So a single Supreme Court justice might ride circuit and do that. That evolved so that now we have fixed circuit courts of appeals throughout the United States that hear each one will hear all of the cases within its geographical boundaries. Now, at that point, I just want to show you where those geographical boundaries are. Now, in the previous slide, I showed you go from the district courts, United States district courts, up to the circuit courts of appeal. And I said that the circuit courts of appeal cover geographical areas that contain those districts. Again, these are not the states. Their boundaries are created by the boundaries of the states, but this is the federal system, not the state court system. A lot of people get confused on that. I would start where we are, but it's a little small. It might be more interesting to start down here. Because you wonder, you have a 5, the 5th Circuit, and you have the 11th Circuit next to each other, and oddly it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. What is 11 doing over here? Can anybody guess why 5 and 11 would be next to each other like that, based on history? If it was like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, why would 5 and 11, why would 11 be way down here instead of over there? Yes?
Because of the Civil War?
Nope, but it's a good guess. The answer was because of the Civil War, but it was not. It happened well after the Civil War. It happened when a lot of people started moving to Florida. Yes?
Cuba?
Nope. Cuba's near Florida, but it didn't bring in that many federal cases. not because of Cuba, not because of Civil War, because of population. Was that you going to say, population? No. Why would population create such a thing?
More people, more need for...
More people, more lawsuits, yeah, right. More people, more cases, exactly. So what happened was, this was originally all the Fifth Circuit. The blue and the green were all the Fifth Circuit. And people sometimes call it the 5-11 split. What happened was the population got bigger and bigger in these southern states. And not just Florida, but you know, Florida through Texas. And there was just more than that circuit could handle. You know, because you had all these districts. You had the district, you had several districts in Florida. You have a district of, you know, there's districts in Alabama. There's a district of, there's Alabama. You know, I don't even want to go through state by state, but you know, all these federal districts added up to a lot of appeals for just the Fifth Circuit. So at some point, Congress said, well, we need to create a new federal circuit and split it off. And so what happened, I think maybe around the mid-20th century. I don't remember the exact timing of it, but the 5th and 11th split. So an easy way to look at this, I mean, the easiest one to look at really is the 10th Circuit, because everything's big. But what you can see here is that within any circuit, the district courts all go up to that circuit. So, for example, all the district courts in Texas, the appeals are going to be heard by the 5th Circuit. All the district courts in Florida, and again, they're federal courts, they just happen to be geographically in Florida. All those cases will be heard by the 11th Circuit. So, and of course, all the district courts in Louisiana, New Orleans is in the Eastern District of Louisiana, big maritime venue, you know, they'll all go to the 5th Circuit. What about us up here in this tight little corner? What circuit are we in? Can anybody see from the map? These are, actually this is not on Brightspace yet, but it will be. Yeah.
Two.
Yeah, we're in the 2nd Circuit. United States Court of Appeals for the 2nd Circuit. So this one I don't have to look at the map to tell you. All the appeals coming from the 4 districts in New York, Northern, Southern, Eastern, Western, plus all appeals from the District of Vermont and all appeals from the District of Connecticut go to the 2nd Circuit. That's it. Only those district courts. The first, you've got these New England states plus Puerto Rico, and the third, you've got New Jersey and Delaware and Pennsylvania plus the U.S. Virgin Islands. So it's interesting that these northeastern circuits, the first and the third, they get a nice tropical place for the judges to go in the wintertime to go to a federal courthouse and hear cases. The 2nd Circuit judges have to stay up here in the cold north. So when I get appointed to the federal judiciary, I think I'd like to be a 3rd Circuit Court of Appeals judge, because then I will go down to the Virgin Islands in the winter. I'll settle for the 1st Circuit. I like Puerto Rico. I spent a lot of time there. But the 2nd Circuit, it's just like, where do you go in the winter? You have to, the freezing cold. But seriously, you know, these are all federal courts too. There is a District of Puerto Rico. I won't even get into the politics of Puerto Rico, but we do have, there is federal jurisdiction there, and the same with U.S. Virgin Islands. So, 1st Circuit is most of the New England states, except for Vermont and Connecticut, and it also gets Puerto Rico. 3rd gets Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and also the Virgin Islands. 2nd gets District of Vermont, District of Connecticut, and the 4 districts in New York. And those are the ones up here. I'm only admitted to the 2nd and 3rd. I almost had a case that took me to the 1st, and I conceivably could have something that takes me into the 11th sometime soon, but we'll see. Anyway, that's how it's laid out. The way appeals are taken, the appellant, the person who is, you know, challenging the district court's opinion, would file a notice of appeal in front of, you know, one of these U.S. courts, circuit courts of appeal, and they'd have to put in all the papers. We're not going to go into details on that. And then it would be heard. How many judges do you think you get on a Court of Appeals panel in these circuit courts of appeal? Take a guess. You got 9 in the Supreme Court. You got 1 judge as a district judge below. What do you think you get there in the middle? Take a guess. How many people think it's an even number of judges? How many people think it's an odd number of judges? Yeah, it's usually, why do they set up an odd number of judges?
So it's not even.
So you can just pass up.
Yeah.
Right, so that you, if you have a disagreement, you won't have a tie. Right. Bottom line is the typical, and there are variations where sometimes all the judges get involved, it's called en banc, but typically, an appeal to, a circuit court of appeal is going to have 3 judges deciding it. What's the next level after that? What if you lose in the circuit court of appeal, you lost in the second circuit, you lost in the district court, you lost in the second circuit, your client has money, what do you try to do next? Where do you want to go? What's at the top? What's the highest court of the United States? Supreme Court of the United States, yeah. That's the last. Okay. We're going to freeze this, and now we're going to talk about the interaction between the state and the federal courts. And okay, we were just talking about the circuit courts of appeals, looked at a map showing which ones contain which districts. If you want to appeal from this, you have to go there, the U.S. Supreme Court. Generally speaking, the Supreme Court doesn't have to take cases. There are certain ones they do have to take, like, a state versus state, New York versus New Jersey. They would have original jurisdiction, they would hear that. But for the most part, they do it by writ of certiorari, which is just a nice way of saying that you have to ask them if they want the case, and if they say yes, you get to go there. So that's the final arbiter of federal law, unless, of course, Congress changes it, or if it's something that Congress can't change, maybe it's an amendment to the Constitution, but it pretty much stops there. Famous phrase from, I forget who wrote it, maybe, I'm trying to think, might have been Holmes. We are not final because we're infallible. We're infallible because we're final. In other words, they don't presume to get it right, but they do get the last word. Actually, I think some of them do presume to get it right, but they're just trying to be modest. In any event, it pretty much ends with the Supreme Court of the United States, unless you're going to have Congress fix whatever you're challenging. If maybe it was challenging statute, Congress could fix it. Or if it's a constitutional question and the Supreme Court has ruled on it, a constitutional amendment could change it. But for purposes of admiralty law, you can think of this as the last stop. Now, quick set of review over here, not review, but introduction over here. In New York, and not other states, we have a system that looks just like this, and I'm just going to quickly go through the names of those courts. We're not going to be as concerned with state courts in this course as we are with the federal side. There are a lot of trial level courts in New York, but generally speaking, the trial court of general jurisdiction over matters of all kinds is actually called Supreme Court. So it's confusing. That's Supreme Court in the federal system. This is Supreme Court in New York. I don't know why they call it Supreme, but it's down at the bottom. It's not up here. And they're county by county. So there's a Supreme Court Nassau County, a Supreme Court Kings County, and so on. They're the same, just like the district courts. You get in there, you get one judge, you get your decision. Then we have intermediate appellate courts. Real quick, in New York, there are 4 departments. They're not called circuits, they're called departments. And again, they're geographically split. So for example, the first department contains the Bronx and Manhattan, and the second department contains Kings, Queens, Nassau, and Suffolk. In fact, they kind of parallel the eastern and southern districts to some extent. I think Staten Island is in one and out of the other, as far as geography. But the bottom line is, you do have these intermediate appellate courts, and then you have the state's highest court. The state of New York, you get, I forget if it's 5 or 7 justices. No, let me think. You get 5 on here, you get 7 up here. There's actually a panel of 5 instead of 3 like in the federal courts. If you're in, appellate division, Supreme Court Appellate Division, First Department, for example, which is an intermediate appellate court for like an appeal from, Supreme Manhattan, you would get a panel of 5, but sometimes they run short. Like in the second department, you typically only get 4 because they don't have enough judges to go around, and then you could have ties. Up here, you get 7. But let's just see. We got 5 minutes left. Let's just see if anybody knows what the name of New York's highest state court is. The highest court in the state. It obviously can't be Supreme because this is Supreme. Go ahead.
New York State Court of Appeals?
Correct. The Court of Appeal, he said New York State Court of Appeals. So it's New York State Court of Appeals of the state of New York, whatever. 7 justices, and that is the last word on all matters of state law. Now, a concluding thought, since we only have 5 minutes left. What about that arrow? It's a little hard to read. It says appeals from state to U.S. Supreme Court. You can never go from here over here. If you want to get from this side to that side, you've got to go up and over. In other words, if you start a case in state court, you're stuck in state court. Maritime case, doesn't matter. If they're applying maritime law, great. But you don't get to say, oh, you got it wrong, we're going to take it over to the feds and see if they can fix it. We're going to take it to the Court of Appeals, Circuit Court of Appeals to the Second Circuit. You can't do that. You're trapped in here. The only way you can get to a federal court is go up and over, which is a very long path and you may never get there. So let's say you have an admiralty case and you bring it in Supreme Court, Bronx County, and the judge is wrong and doesn't decide the question correctly and dismisses the case, say, on the law, but the case should not have been dismissed. And you then go to the Appellate Division First Department, and that panel of 5 judges gets it wrong. And boy, you wish you get a real federal judge in there that really knows maritime law. Well, you might be able to, but not from there. Then you have to go to the state highest court, still on a question of admiralty law, still on a question of federal law, but state judges will decide it. And let's say it's a panel of 9 judges on the New York Court of Appeals, and they get it wrong, 5-4. 4 of them understood it, but 5 of them got it wrong. And now you've got a question of federal law. It's not a question of state law. Can you go over there? How many people say yes? How many people think if you get let's say you got a 5-4 decision in the New York Court of Appeals, the state's highest court, and they have said, your admiralty case, you lose. But you know that you shouldn't lose on the law, but 5 out of the 9 judges said you do. Can you take that over to the U.S. Supreme Court? Yes, I see nodding. Yes, you can. But you can't do it as of right, meaning that you still have to petition for certiorari to get there. So you would have to get the decision from this court and then ask the U.S. Supreme Court to take it. They do take, I wouldn't say too many admiralty cases that come from state court, but the Supreme Court takes a fair number of cases that went up through the state courts, particularly in the criminal arena, right? Because, criminal procedure stuff in state court, sometimes there are federal considerations of criminal procedure, and, the Supreme Court might want to weigh in on it. Anyway, an important thing to remember, take away in the last 2 minutes of the class here, is that sometimes the first time you'll see a federal judge deciding a case of federal admiralty law could be the U.S. Supreme Court. Because if you start in state court, you're stuck there. You don't get to move it over there. So suppose you go in here with an admiralty case, they're supposed to apply federal maritime law, but you have to go all the way up here and they still get it wrong. The first time a federal judge sees it could be the U.S. Supreme Court. I can't think of a single case where it's happened, but in theory, that's exactly how it works. So I just wanted you to understand that. Last week we talked about which types of cases state courts can handle that are maritime, which type they can't. I'm not going to review that. In fact, I would say we are just about out of time, so I shall see you Monday.